IVM.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Rachita.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project.
We have as our guest today Anirudh Kanisetti, host of the podcast series Echoes of India. In this episode, we deep dive into The Fate of Rome by Kyle Harper in the first half of the podcast.
In the second half, we also discuss Ka by Roberto Calasso, Against the Grain by James C. Scott, Political Violence in Ancient India by Upinder Singh, and Archaeology of Hindu Ritual by Michael Willis.
Our conversation with Anirudh reflects on how climate and disease were integral parts that led to the decline of the Roman Empire, the Vedas and Purans, the Gupta dynasty, and how archaeology led to creation of many Hindu rituals.
Let's dive in.
The rise and fall of Rome remind us that the story of human civilization is, through and through, an environmental drama. The flourishing of the empire in the halcyon days of the 2nd century, the arrival of a new kind of virus from far beyond the Roman world, the rupture of the imperial grand bargain in the aftermath of the pandemic, the meltdown of the empire and the concatenation of climate and health disasters in the 3rd century, the neutron bomb of bubonic plague, the insidious onset of a new age of ice, the final collapse of anything recognizable as the Roman Empire, should teach us something about the nature of history.
Thank you, Anirudh Kanisetti. That was an excerpt from the book The Fate of Rome by Kyle Harper. We'll be right back after this to discuss the book in more detail.
Hi listeners, we at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund have come up with a special podcast series called MF 101 in collaboration with Bloomberg Quint. MF 101 is an informative series that will help you understand the recipe behind mutual fund investments. And what's more, it's coming from the chefs of the mutual fund buffet table, from the very own fund managers and analysts who are the manufacturers of the funds that help you realize your investment goals. New episodes out every Monday. You can listen to the show on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project. I am your co-host Satyajit, otherwise known as Onion Knight in most food circles. I'm hosting this podcast with my co-founder at the Open Library Project, Rachita Sharma.
Hi guys, my name is Rachita and I'm an ex-banker who gave up my banking profession to follow my passion and run libraries across the world. The Open Library Project is a non-fiction book library service offered to businesses on a subscription basis. We're trying to move away from the run-of-the-mill library concept by setting up rotational and locational curated libraries at co-working spaces, corporate and business incubators. The idea here is to create value, build a knowledge community, and encourage a growth mindset amongst our members.
Today we have with us on the show Anirudh Kanisetti, host of Echoes of India podcast. He also works at the Takshashila Institute at Bangalore as a research analyst. Echoes of India is the story of India like you've never heard before. Host Anirudh takes you on a journey through its wonders, from Greek art to Afghanistan to thriving ports of Tamil Nadu. Along the way, monks debate, queens boast, and armies roar. From philosophy to politics to economics, the past comes back to life, noisy, breathing, and as thriving as the Indian subcontinent is today. Welcome to the show, Anirudh.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
It's lovely to have you on the show. And your selection of books is quite interesting because, it follows a pattern of history, which is something we've not really discussed in detail yet on our podcast. So we'll definitely start with the first book, that's Fate of Rome, from which the excerpt was. Would you like to deep dive into it and tell us more about the book?
Let me just say I'm super excited to be the inaugural history speaker on your podcast,
Great
as
to
it
have
were.
you.
And maybe just recap what we were talking about a little earlier about why is it that history as non-fiction isn't really mainstream, as it were, right?
Right.
It's because the whole idea that history has poor returns on time spent. And I can see how that makes sense, because if you really want to understand history, you have to dive rather deep, right?
Yeah.
But in my experience, at least, diving deep into history gives you this deep, almost intuitive understanding of social, cultural, economic, and overall historical change,
Right.
which is absolutely invaluable no matter what field of work you're in, like whether you're a venture capitalist or a researcher in, I don't know, a think tank like myself.
Right.
It's absolutely, it's a very critical skill to have. And that I think is why I've kept The Fate of Rome as my top recommendation, is because it's a book that really engages with the question of what is history.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I think there's a general tendency to think of history as just this sort of dry succession of, okay, so there's this king and then there's that king and then this king killed that king and so
he
on and
took
so
over
forth.
the empire.
It just becomes this endless parade of dry characters who don't really have anything to set them apart.
Right.
But to me, that's not what history is at all. As I read in the excerpt, right, history needs to be seen as this environmental drama. I think the last speaker that you had spoke about Sapiens, right? And there was an excerpt which talked about how humanity, Homo sapiens, has had this massive impact, which is equivalent to the Ice Age.
Right.
So that's absolutely correct. But it also makes you think of humans as this species that's always dominated the environment, which hasn't always been the case. Us having this degree of control over the forces of nature, such as it is now, which it really isn't that much, is still a very new thing.
Yeah.
For most of human history, we've been very, very vulnerable to environmental disasters. There's so many Indian cities, for example. There's a city called Kaveri Pumpattinam in Tamil Nadu, which used to be this massive trading emporium. Completely wiped out by a tsunami in roughly the 3rd century AD, and you never hear about it again, just like vanishes.
It's gone. Yeah.
Gone from the history books as well.
It's in the history books.
It's in the history
books. It's gone as a city is what I'm trying to say. It just lives on in legends and memories.
Right.
Yeah, but that's important, right? Because to understand where we are at today, it's very important to know where we came from.
Exactly.
Or how we got here.
Exactly.
And it's just like for any business, if you want to know how they've achieved success, you have to know how it all started, how they built their foundation.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what history does.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
And why the fate of Rome is interesting is because it says that if you want to understand the history of Rome, don't look at Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar or whatever freaking Caesar. Right. I can really name a lot of Caesars, but let's not get into that. But the point is, the fate of Rome talks about this thing called the Roman climate optimum. So just a bit of a note on methodology. So what these guys did to write this book is that they dug into the Alps.
Okay.
In the Alps, they extracted these long cylinders of ice called ice cores, and they analyzed the sediments in each of the levels of the ice.
Okay.
Right? So since the Roman Empire was this massive economic entity, right? It was industrialized, but at a very rudimentary level. So you see increased pollution levels in the ice cores of the Alps.
Okay.
Right?
Increasing with every layer.
So as the empire gets denser and denser, you actually see that happening, and then you see a sudden fall when the empire collapses, and then it only reaches that level again like in the 18th or 19th century.
Okay.
Now the very first thing I thought about when I was reading that was, if we were to do something like that with the Himalayas, what could we learn about Indian history, right? Because if you were to do the sort of interdisciplinary analysis of all the sources we have available, instead of just looking at inscriptions and going to a temple and thinking, oh wow, this great king must have built it. What if you look deeper? If you look at how Indian civilizations have impacted the environment around us, it could really challenge a lot of the ways that we think about Indian history.
Yeah, in fact, also the book talks about, the plague and how the climate fostered the plague and how that led to the fall of Rome. So,
and here's the interesting thing. The Roman Empire, by expanding so far, so quickly, kind of laid the seeds for its own collapse.
Right.
Because if you look at and this is not because of corruption or some inherent tendency of empires to collapse, but rather if you look at the latitudinal extent of it, right? The northernmost part of it is in freaking Scotland, which is really cold sort of biome, and the southernmost bit of it is near Ethiopia, which is where you have monsoon winds. And in between, you have this massive stretch, this inland sea called the Mediterranean. So you have these very, very complex weather patterns. You have all these complex ecosystems which have suddenly been connected. Now you have human beings going through each of them because there's market opportunities, economic opportunities. So the empire grows and grows, but along with it, pathogens are also mutating, evolving, coming into new environments, coming into contact with each other. And because of that, it's inevitable that at some point there would have been a public health crisis, especially because Romans had, let's face it, very bad toilet hygiene. They had public toilets where people used to share the same sponge to, let's not get into that. But the point is, it was almost inevitable.
I hope they didn't find that in the soil.
They have found, that's how we know, because they have found extensive traces of
truth is.
But this is the sort of thing that we just don't know about Indian history, right?
Yeah.
And that actually got me... Sorry, you're saying something.
Yeah, and it's sad that, we're back at the same place because we are again trying to develop faster than probably nature can take.
Yes.
We don't learn from our mistakes.
Exactly.
History does repeat itself quite a bit, right?
History teaches you that, right? Because I think now in the 21st century, we are facing a very similar situation to the Romans in the third century, or maybe the Maya in the 9th century, where you're like, everything is fine. Let's just keep doing what we're doing, and things are going to be all right. But no, there are things beyond our control, which are just going to cause the collapse of civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's going to happen because, hey, I'm an optimistic guy and I got to pay my bills. But the point is that human nature doesn't change. It's only the technological environment that we live in that changes. The underlying forces of nature, the forces of evolution, the way that ecosystems form, the way that economic networks form, they've been more or less the same ever since the beginning of human civilization. And there's a lot of value in understanding how that happens and applying those parallels to the current day as well.
Right.
Because of just how much they can teach us about why people do the things they do. I mean, you might think, damn, why is it that Russia is totally out to screw the United States?
Right.
Yeah.
And the obvious answer would be, it's the Cold War rivalry playing itself out again. But it actually goes even deeper than that. From at least the 14th century, Russia has seen itself as a new Rome, as this great, massive continental power that has to dominate Europe, and that's a major force for global stability.
Yeah.
So it is inevitable that they would be rivals to any other power which tries to become, this superpower. Right? So it happened with when the English got together with the French. That's why the Russians joined the First World War on the side of the Germans, right? Because they want to balance out these so-called sea-based civilizations.
Right.
And that's the exact same pattern you're seeing today, where even though the average Russian is going through very difficult economic conditions, the Russian leadership is like, hey, this is our destiny.
We're going to take it.
Yeah, we are going to do this no matter what.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand these deeper patterns, basically.
It's very interesting that you brought up Sapiens earlier, because we had a chance to meet Yuval Noah Harari when he was here in Bombay, and some of the things that he says is that we are evolving so much as a human civilization. Technology is being integrated externally right now into our lives, but soon maybe it will be integrated internally. So you have no idea what the repercussions of that is going to be, right? Because how can you even predict something at that scale?
Yeah.
If there's mass adoption, say for example, of humans decide to insert chips into their arms to track whatever they want to track, you don't know what the effect of that is going to be, right? Because it's never been done before.
Exactly.
So even though the times are different, I'm sure there are parallels that can be drawn to maybe the Roman Empire, or maybe times in history where like you mentioned earlier, that we are on the cusp of change again. So maybe it is time that we go back to our history books and try and avoid what is avoidable. At least acknowledge that we may be on the cusp of
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very, very important to go back and learn from history, because I think that's one thing that humans as species are generally not very good at doing.
Yeah.
If you look at you guys have heard of the Bronze Age collapse?
I know of the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
So the Bronze Age is like the first emergence of really massive states and civilizations,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So you have states all across the Fertile Crescent. So Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Anatolia, and you even have the Indus Valley in the modern day Pakistan, I suppose. But it's all these are massive urban civilizations, and the very first urban civilization, if you think about it, and they're all deeply connected through trade.
Yeah.
Okay.
There have been ruins found off the coast of Turkey,
Right.
which were, I don't know, like Greek or whatever. And if you look at the stuff that's inside them, they have stuff from every one of these civilizations.
Oh.
Yeah, so they basically...
They were globalized,
Yeah,
that's the
right,
thing.
yeah, right,
That was
right.
their equivalent of globalization.
Right.
They had all these different sort of cultural influences. They were all talking to each other in whatever language, we don't know.
Yeah.
But it had happened. And then there was a series of devastating earthquakes in Anatolia, sometime around 1250, destroyed a bunch of cities. And then within about a century, 200 years, all these civilizations collapse.
Okay.
Gone. except for Egypt because it had the Nile River, but all of them, like even the Indus Valley civilization.
Right.
Obviously there's a bunch of other factors also happening.
Yeah.
But you have to think about what happens when you have a very complex, deeply integrated system, and then one thing goes wrong. It just like oscillates out of control.
Yeah.
This is an engineering metaphor.
Right.
Since I'm technically supposed to be an engineer.
The dominoes effect.
Yes. It's a domino effect on a massive scale, and this might be scary to hear because think about how interconnected the world economy is now.
Right.
When the 2008 financial crisis happened, it sent
we saw
massive
throughout the world.
shockwaves throughout the world.
For sure.
Yeah.
Imagine, for example, the Himalayas or the Hindu Kush mountains losing a lot of their water. Imagine the consequences of a substantial proportion of Chinese and Indian people not having enough water.
Yeah.
There would be massive refugee movements, which we are not prepared to handle. The kind of political consequences that would cause, it cause the collapse of civilization as we know it? I don't know. But we need to be planning for it. We need to be preparing for it.
It's great that you ask these questions, and that's what you do on your podcast as well, Echoes of India. It's like you're, asking questions related to history. You're making people question, why we're here, how we're here, how we should not do what we did in the past, which is really great. And
Thank you.
could you also tell us, who would you recommend The Fate of Rome to? I think everybody should be reading it, but yes, maybe pertinent to, who it would help the most.
That's a very good question, actually. I would say that the number one audience for it would probably be environmentalists.
Okay.
Because it would give them a really deep sense of how environmental changes can trigger massive societal and political changes.
Right.
Aside from that, would I recommend this book to a venture capitalist?
Will they get a return on investment? You know what? Before you answer that, I'd just like to say, like doing a non-fiction podcast, book-related podcast, we've seen that you can find paradigms of relation in books that are not related to your craft at all or your skill at all. That's why when we interview so many people across disciplines, we find that so many things relate from maybe even from a history book can be related to your current business context, right? Like, for example, wars, like businesses in a way, you can learn business strategy from war strategies.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things that can be done. So I'm sure that the right VC would be able to pull out the right context.
Okay, then VCs, if you're
VCs
listening,
as well.
then please do pick up The Fate of Rome.
Great. And on that note, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back after this.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please make sure that you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just a couple of notes up front. One is that we are still running our listener survey. That's ivmpodcast.com/survey. The survey is only going to run till the end of the week. So if you want a chance to win that awesome mug that we're giving out, please make sure that you fill out that survey. Also, I wanted to put out a quick reminder that if you're enjoying what you're listening to, please take a screenshot of what you're listening to, tag us on Instagram, and we'll put that in our story so that everybody else can see what you're listening to. Also, please don't forget to put in a comment. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by lawyer Ambar Rana, who talks about his family's army background, how jingoism is detrimental to patriotism, the noteworthy cases in his law practice, and how he addresses them on his podcast, Know Your Kanun. That's on the IVM network. On episode 2 of our new foreign policy show, States of Anarchy, Hamsani talks to Dave Salvo and Brett Schaefer about Russian hacking in the US elections. On How To, citizen Meghnad and Shreyas are joined by comedian and satirist Ashish Shakya to discuss Chapter 9 on public facilities. On the Sponge podcast, Ambi explains why it is consequential to set expectations on a realistic level and then slowly elevate them. On Shunya One, founder of Ayopo, Chirag Kriplani, joined Srila Aditya to talk about the growing Indonesian tech startup culture. On Ganatantra, Saryu and Alok are joined by expert Venkat Anand to discuss the influence of social media in the coming elections and how it has changed the playing field. And with that, let's continue on with your show.
Welcome back. We still have with us Anirudh Kanisetti, podcast host of the Echoes of India podcast. Welcome back, Anirudh.
Thank you.
So, the next book that we're going into is Ka, Stories of the Mind and Gods of India by Roberto Calasso. So we had another guest who discussed another book by Roberto Calasso recently called The Art of the Publisher, which was very interesting.
Okay.
And this is more on the historical side. So
The Shruti and the Smriti.
Yes, exactly. It's a fascinating read about Indian mythology. I'd say easily the most thought-provoking read I've come across on Indian mythology.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is it's not like this category of myths where they're like, okay, these are the 3 big gods, and the 3 big gods do this, and these are all the roles of the subsidiary gods. There's a very interesting sort of narrative chain that goes through the book. So the very beginning of it, like the first chapter is about Garuda. Okay. Right? So, and it ends with Garuda figuring out that he wants to learn the Vedas. And then he sits down and he starts to think, to whom should the sacrifice be offered? And then it transitions to this description of the creator god Prajapati. Okay. And the lines like still stick with me because they're so powerful. It goes, Prajapati was alone. He didn't know if he existed or not. Because if you have nothing around you, how do you know if you exist or not? Right? And this it just drops these nuclear bombs of existentialism on you. Yeah. And what is really surprising is that this is all the philosophy of the Rig Veda and the Upanishads that have been spun into this fascinating narrative. Is this very postmodern sort of take on Hindu mythology, which I think is absolutely a must read, if for no other reason than just to understand just how vast this and ancient this religion actually is. And to think that, I don't know, some like a bunch of like cowherders in 1500 BC were having the same sort of kind of existential thoughts
crisis
as we are. It's super identifiable, you know.
And also the Vedas and the Upanishads are really extensive, so this would probably bring it all beautifully in a book.
Cuts out a lot of the boring stuff like how do you perform a sacrifice and all that, and just focus on what is a sacrifice, why is a sacrifice, all the really deep questions that make you think about religion in general and philosophy.
It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating.
The next book we're moving on to is Against the Grain by James C. Scott. What about this book stood out for you?
So we were actually talking about the Bronze Age earlier, right? So what is fascinating about Against the Grain is it challenges, it takes the traditional understanding we have of how civilization formed and inverts it.
Okay.
So generally we think that, we were hunter-gatherers and we were primitive and we were really sad. And then we somehow figure out how to like plant crops and so on, and then we became happy though. And Yuval Noah Harari has challenged that in *Sapiens*, of course. But what Scott does is that he really dives deeper into how this transition happened. And his argument is not that agriculture gave rise to the state, but rather that states gave rise to agriculture. Okay, like people had to be forced to give up their chilled out hunter-gatherer life and to work in a farm all day and break their backs. Right. And like something as simple as a wall, right? You might think a wall is something that people built to keep out the monsters of the night. But he argues that no, it was something that was built to keep the population in the town so you could tax them.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah. That's fascinating.
And it makes a bunch of really interesting arguments. So for example, these early states were obsessed with fighting each other and capturing resources from each other, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So they need to have armies.
Right.
How do you create armies? By forcing women to just reproduce. Okay. And you have religion for that, right? So religion
plays a part in
and patriarchy and the state, they're all like tied in at this very fundamental structural level, which still, I would say, arguably permeates
still
civilization.
Today, right? I mean,
exactly.
And it's global. It's not even just bound to India. I mean, we always think that India is the only because we live here, right?
Yes, but he's talking about the Middle East,
right?
And he's talking about Babylon. He's talking about all these places that if you read them in your history textbooks, they'll be like, oh yeah, these were cool civilizations and they had these ziggurats and all that.
But the truth is that
they were so
inherently
dark. Yeah, they were like, oh damn, man.
Yeah, that's a great perspective though. It went the other way around.
Right. We are moving on to the next book, which is Political Violence in Ancient India by Upinder Singh. Tell us about this book, Anirudh.
Okay. So there's a general misconception going around that Indian states weren't really that violent, or that they weren't interested in conquering outside India. And Upinder Singh in this book really challenges that notion. She argues that violence was fundamental to state formation in India, even though it was regulated by a sort of philosophical and religious context. Violence was absolutely important and sanctioned at multiple levels of society. That actually ties into what James C. Scott is saying in Against the Grain, is that states are only able to form by violence.
Right.
Now that violence might be regulated by a broader religious structure, but that doesn't change the fact that violence is inherent to the way that states were formed. And what Upinder Singh does is that she kind of expands that throughout Indian history. So she doesn't come to the medieval period, but she stops in the Gupta Empire. Okay. So she starts off with the Mahabharata, And if you look at the Mahabharata, has this deep obsession with what is a just war, for example.
Right.
Fundamentally, it's an argument about what violence is acceptable in a state and what is not acceptable.
Right.
And she even looks at Buddhism of all things, and says that Buddhism has this sort of primitive version of the social contract theory, where Buddha is supposed to have said that everything was utterly bonkers, people were just eating each other up, and then the people elected a king and said, we're going to pay you taxes, you punish the evildoers and keep the rest of us safe.
Right.
Which is very similar to what Rousseau was saying like thousands of years later, right? So basically this sort of underlying arrangement,
so like religion and politics is aligned
to regulate how much violence is performed, so that people are still willing to pay taxes.
Right. So it all comes back to like formation of the cities, and maybe the inverted structure that you spoke about for the formation of cities.
It has a lot of value.
Maybe the actual thing that happened.
So do you think history books can be reread often? Like, do you reread any of these books multiple times?
That's a good question, actually. So for me, how it works is that I get obsessed with a particular period.
Okay.
And then I read multiple books about that period.
Okay.
Because the thing is that if you have the same bits of evidence, different writers can come away with completely different perspectives on what that evidence means.
Right.
So James Scott, for example, is presenting this contrarian view of evidence that we already had before. Right.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily think that history books can or should be reread. I think that history in general needs to constantly be thought about and read from multiple different perspectives.
So you suggest that in case you're interested in any particular historical event, or you should read multiple perspectives on it to get the clear picture.
Yeah.
Otherwise it may be just whitewashed as per the author's
Because if you just, the thing with history is that we can never know exactly what happened in history.
Yeah, right. It's all about everybody's perspective on it.
But by its nature, history just leaves these slight traces. There's so many holes in the historical record.
Right.
And as I think it's important, I would say the best thing you can take away from historical reading is critical thinking.
Right.
Because the second you read two different authors writing about the same event, you're like, damn.
Is it even like how so different? Right?
Yeah, they're so different. So what is historical knowledge? How can we make conclusions? And that sort of critical thinking, I think, is supremely applicable in every field of life.
Like even for the Vedas and Puran and all of that, that's what they say, right? That maybe it was just somebody who wrote, a really nice fiction story to get people to follow a certain kind of lifestyle. Yeah. And God knows if that really existed or not. So that's
yes, absolutely.
Thought. And since you mentioned the Gupta dynasty, the last book that you wanted to talk about also talks about the Gupta dynasty. Yes. So could you,
okay, so
take us through it.
Have you guys been to Udaygiri? It's in Madhya Pradesh. It's not far from Sanchi. And it's basically this fascinating astro-religio-political site.
Okay.
Astro-religio-political. Okay.
When I was reading this book, my eyebrows just kept going higher and higher into my forehead until they disappear into my hairline because of the fascinating arguments that this guy makes. So the thing is that a lot of stuff you see in museums has been taken away from where it was originally kept. Right?
Yeah.
But in the location where it was originally, it would have been positioned for a particular reason.
Right.
Now in Udaygiri, these are all cave temples. So obviously nobody can take them away and put them in a museum, right? So the original placing is still preserved. Now the thing with Udaygiri is it's located near the Tropic of Capricorn. Is that, or Cancer? Cancer is the northern one? Wow, nobody here knows. Yes. Cool. Okay, so basically it's located near one of the tropics, and that means that during the summer solstices it has like this very long day.
Okay.
Right? So basically the way that the Guptas carved panels there was meant to light up particular caves on particular calendar days.
Okay.
And those were tied to religious ceremonies.
Okay.
So for example, there's this carving of a Varaha, this massive colossal man boar that's lifting the earth out of the ocean.
Okay.
And Michael Willis argues that this boar should be seen as a metaphor for one of the Gupta emperors.
Okay.
Because Samudragupta is supposed to have defeated the Naga dynasty.
Right.
And and Samudragupta means literally guarded by the sea. If you look at that Varaha, he's very clearly coming out of the sea. He's defeated Naga that's lying below him.
Okay.
And the argument is that Varaha is the lord of the earth, right? Bhupati. He's married to the earth, which he's lifting out of the water. And if you draw a parallel between the king and Varaha, you're giving the king the right to grant land to people.
Okay.
Which means the king can build temples and say, I'm assigning this land to this temple. So essentially what you're doing is you're using this astrological thing to create a tangible presence of divinity.
Okay.
You're connecting that divinity, which is a religious concept, to a political thing, which is the king. And the king is thereby gaining economic rights.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Think how complex that
That's
is.
very complex, yeah. I mean, to think that they were doing such kind of, what do you say?
It is so complex.
Yeah.
You don't,
Manipulation would be wrong, but
Propaganda.
Propaganda.
Let's say propaganda.
Government advertising or marketing. That's the thing. You think that ancient people were somehow more primitive than us, not as sophisticated. But those guys are bloody brilliant. You don't need to make up stories that they had spaceships and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
Their things are equally remarkable if you actually look at the history that we already have around us all the time. And that's why my podcast is called Echoes of India. The idea is that history is always around us.
Yeah.
We can always hear it. If you walk around, even if you walk around Mumbai, you'll see influences from all these different historical time periods. You'll hear languages that evolved in different historical contexts, all being spoken in this one place.
Right.
But you never stop to think about the fact that they have come from so many different places.
Yeah.
They've come from so many different contexts. We just take it for granted, but we don't understand just how remarkable the world is that we're walking around in.
Yeah, now I get the context of the name also, the archaeology of Hindu rituals.
Yes, yes.
That makes sense.
Great. So thank you, Anirudh, for being with us.
Thank you guys for having me.
And we hope to have you again on the show.
Yes.
I hope so too.
Please listen to the Echoes of India podcast, available on IVM Podcasts as well as wherever else you listen to podcasts. And a big thank you to all our listeners. You can follow the Open Library Project on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook for latest updates on our events. And stay tuned for the next Paperback podcast on IVM Podcasts. Happy reading. You can follow IVM Podcasts on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at IVM Podcasts.
The most engaging and the most useful conversations you may have in your life are likely to be with your most challenging customers. Hi, I'm Ambi Parmeshwaran, and on this podcast, I will take you through my book, Sponge Leadership Lessons I Learned from My Clients. Packed with real stories about real people, but most of all, packed with the innumerable lessons I soaked up from some of the most iconic business leaders like Ratan Tata, Azim Premji, S. Ramadorai, Karsanbhai Patel, M. Damodaran, Dr. Kurian, and many more. Don't forget to tune in to the Sponge podcast. Keep sponging to keep learning.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that their insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to The Seen and the Unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.